medieval intimacy. Not quite what the movies promised. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into a topic that's as hilariously awkward as it is historically fascinating, the strange, scandalous, and sometimes surprisingly sweet world of medieval sex. Before we go any further, hit that like button if you appreciate the wild ride that is human history, and don't forget to subscribe if this kind of deep dive content is your thing. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing how far this little corner of the internet reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's get cozy with a period of time where romance meant more goats than roses. Let's start by smashing a myth that pop culture absolutely refuses to let go of. Medieval intimacy wasn't all silk sheets, candlelight, and a harpist playing softly in the background while lovers whispered in old French. The reality, not even close. Most people lived in homes where the bed, the kitchen, and the barn were basically one room separated by smells. If you wanted some alone time, you had to plan it like a heist, wait until the kids were asleep. Grandma wasn't snoring and the chicken wasn't judging you from the corner. Privacy, practically non-existent. In peasant homes, the idea of a private bedroom didn't even exist. It was all one cramped space, shared with kids' livestock and the occasional in-law who overstayed their welcome by a decade. Curtains were a luxury, beds were shared, and among the nobility, it wasn't much better. Servants often slept at the foot of the bed or just stood around pretending not to hear anything happening. Noble households actually documented sleeping arrangements for religious or legal reasons, which sounds great, until you realize that means some poor scribe had to record that Lord Geoffrey preferred the left side of the mattress. And inns don't even get me started. When traveling, it was totally normal for strangers to bunk together in the same bed. That's right. Imagine being on a business trip, showing up to a medieval Holiday Inn, and finding a guy already in your bed boots, still on snoring like a war horn. Romance was less about timing and more about improvisation. Now for those in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple: no. No privacy, no flirting, no cuddling by candlelight. But human nature being what it is, even those holy walls weren't completely immune to temptation. Many abbeys mysteriously had really high garden walls. Wonder why? But the biggest factor shaping medieval bedroom behavior, the church. And the church had thoughts, a lot of them, about what went on behind closed doors. According to official doctrine, the only acceptable reason for intimacy was reproduction, not pleasure, not bonding, not "I missed you after harvest season," just making babies. Anything else sinful, distracting, possibly a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. This wasn't just something mentioned in Sunday sermons. Bishops and priests actually wrote manuals detailing what married couples could and couldn't do. And trust me, they were oddly specific, like very specific. One popular 13th century marriage guide advised that couples should be intimate without pleasure, without delay, and get this, without sin. Romantic right. Even certain days were off limits. You couldn't get frisky on Sundays because it was the Lord's Day. Fridays were a no-go because of penance. Wednesdays, suspicious. And then you had to factor in the entire seasons of Lent and Advent, plus all the saints' feast days, holy days, fast days, and even lunar phases in some regions. In the end, you were left with maybe 2 or 3 spiritually safe Tuesdays in April. Oh, and even within marriage, passion was frowned upon. The missionary position wasn't just popular, it was the only acceptable option. Anything else was considered morally risky and possibly demonic. And yes, confession played a role in this too. Priests would ask very personal questions to ensure that couples were adhering to the holy playbook. Some confession manuals even had flowcharts. Imagine trying to explain to your local friar why Tuesday after sunset seemed like a good time for marital bonding. But despite all these rules, enforcement was inconsistent. Some regions were stricter than others. Some priests didn't care. And most peasants, they smiled, nodded, and did what they were going to do anyway, quietly. If modern couples struggle to align their schedules, imagine medieval couples trying to plan around the church calendar, a hayloft full of relatives, and a nosy priest named Brother Thomas, who definitely listened through the walls. And speaking of scheduling, let's talk about courtship, or more accurately, the complete lack of it. Romantic relationships in medieval Europe weren't built on candlelit dinners and deep conversations. They were built on livestock, land rights, and strategic alliances. Marriage was primarily a business transaction. Your daughter came with a dowry of linens, a pig, and maybe a plot of land. The groom's family promised not to start a feud over property lines. Deal done. Courtship, when it did happen, was heavily supervised. A young woman might be chaperoned by her mother, her aunt, or even the entire village. Holding hands, scandalous. Among the nobility, marriages were arranged like chess matches. Kings and lords negotiated weddings like treaties in love. That was something you hoped would grow over time, maybe? Peasant men were judged by their land, their tools, and the size of their ox. Women were evaluated by their reputation, their housekeeping skills, and how likely they were to get into arguments at the market. Real romantic stuff. But don't get me wrong, love did exist. It just wasn't the requirement. It was more of a medieval bonus feature. Think of it like downloadable content, extra, not essential. Still, people found ways to connect. Secret notes, whispered songs, long walks to the well, all unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. Just pray you didn't get caught kissing behind the barn, or you'd be looking at a public penance, a fine, or an extremely disappointed father armed with a pitchfork. We're just scratching the surface here. In the next part, we'll dig into chastity belts, medieval contraceptives, and the shocking truth about brothels that were basically Yelp-reviewed by town councils. Stick around. This is going to get wild. Chastity belts, brothels, and the battle against baby boomers. The medieval version. All right, welcome back. So far, we've learned that medieval intimacy wasn't a dreamy montage of lute music and candlelight. It was more like a logistical nightmare with goats, nosy neighbors, and ecclesiastical calendars dictating your love life. But now let's talk about one of the biggest myths to ever make it out of the medieval-era chastity belts. Yes, you've seen them in cartoons, sketchy museums, and maybe even in a history meme or two. Big, clunky iron contraption supposedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war with the key tucked safely into his armor. It sounds wild, cruel, and mechanically questionable. And honestly, it probably is because chastity belts, as we imagine them, were mostly myth. There's no real historical evidence that chastity belts were widely used in the Middle Ages. Most of the belts we see today come from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, a time when people were absolutely obsessed with how repressed medieval folks were. Some of these belts were meant as jokes, warnings, or museum conversation pieces. They weren't actually handed out by priests or sewn into wedding gowns. And really think about it. Hygiene was already, let's say, creative in medieval Europe. Now add a rusty iron contraption to the mix, no user manual, and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith to open. That's not chastity. It's a UTI waiting to happen. So, how was fidelity actually enforced? Not with iron underwear, but with social pressure, surveillance, religion, and matchmaking so intense it could cause long-term trauma. Noble women were practically swaddled in chaperones. Peasant girls had a whole village's worth of unpaid detectives keeping an eye on them. And if anyone got even a whiff of scandal, reputation ruined. Dowry gone. Your family suddenly remembered they had a distant cousin you could visit in another village. Now let's pivot to something even more fascinating, brothels. Because here's the plot twist. While the church was clutching its rosaries and scribes were drafting stern moral treatises, many medieval towns weren't just tolerating brothels. They were regulating them. That's right. In cities across Europe, especially urban centers, brothels were legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, taxed them, and even assigned specific red light districts long before the light bulb was invented. There were even officials with titles like Keeper of Public Women, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds, and they managed the day-to-day operations of these places. Imagine applying for that job on LinkedIn. But why? Why would a society so obsessed with chastity turn a blind eye or even lend a hand to sex work? Simple. Pragmatism. Officials believed that providing a legal, controlled outlet for sexual desires helped reduce bigger social problems, adultery, sexual violence, or people acting on their lust during Lent again. In short, they saw regulated brothels as a necessary evil, like traffic lights or turnips. Now, was the church thrilled about this? Of course not. Officially, the church condemned brothels. Unofficially, some clergy turned a blind eye. Some collected rent from the very same establishments. Yep, that's medieval hypocrisy in action, preaching purity by day, profiting by night. Let's talk about the women who worked in these brothels. Were they living some early version of medieval girls gone wild? Not quite. But it wasn't always pure misery either. Some women chose the profession, especially widows or women without family support. Others, sadly, were coerced or trafficked, particularly in bustling port cities where sailors rolled in with coin and chaos. And yes, there were handbooks for brothel management, actual print documents that outlined expectations like clean linens, basic hygiene standards, and even set business hours. Talk about professionalism. Patrons came from every walk of life, knights, apprentices, merchants, and yes, even monks, despite their vows. I'll just let that sit there. The payment system. Oh, it was delightfully awkward. If you didn't have coins, you might barter with eggs, wool, or bread. Nothing says romantic evening like handing over a bag of turnips. Now let's set the scene. You're in a brothel. The candles are lit. There's music playing. A lady removes her many layers of wool and linen and reveals the smell. That's right. It's time to talk about the glamorous world of medieval hygiene. To be blunt, it was inconsistent. Most peasants bathed once a month, maybe more, if they happened to fall into a river. Soap was either homemade, read sketchy, or imported, and very expensive. Bathhouses existed in many towns, but they were often shut down during plagues, or if they became too scandalous because, apparently, communal bathing sometimes led to more than squeaky clean conversation. If you were rich, you could afford hot water and scented oils. You might even have an attendant scrub you with linen cloths. If you were poor, you had a bucket of cold water and a prayer that no one noticed your personal scent over the smell of your pigs. Also, water was viewed with suspicion. Some believed that bathing too often could weaken the body or make it easier for illness to sneak in through the skin. Cold water was especially suspect, so even those with access might avoid it just to stay strong. So, how did people try to cover the funk? Perfume mostly for the upper class. Deodorant, not a thing. Dental care, maybe some mint leaves ash, or just not smiling with your mouth open. Kissing, probably more dangerous than sword fighting. And let's not forget the layers of clothing. Medieval people wore wool, leather, linen, furs, sometimes all at once. These materials trapped heat, sweat, and every aroma from your day, including the chamber pot and the stew that's been boiling for 3 days straight. And yet, people still managed to fall in love, or at least lust. Maybe it was because everyone smelled the same. Maybe true love really is nose blind. Whatever the case, affection still found a way to bloom, whether in a brothel behind a barn or in a crowded cottage full of chickens. In the next part, we're diving into contraception in the Middle Ages, from herbal brews to bizarre rituals involving beaver testicles. Yes, seriously, get ready. It's about to get creative. Beaver testicles, blessed amulets, and the medieval contraceptive playbook. Welcome back. If you thought the world of medieval romance couldn't get any weirder after chastity belts that never existed and brothels run like small businesses, buckle up. Because now we're stepping into the surprisingly inventive, occasionally horrifying, and weirdly hopeful world of medieval contraception. Let's start with the obvious. Did people in the Middle Ages try to avoid pregnancy? Yes, absolutely. Despite what some historical oversimplifications might suggest, medieval folks were very aware that sex led to babies. And while the church did its absolute best to promote reproduction as the only holy reason for intimacy, real life often had other priorities, like poverty, starvation, and the sheer exhaustion of having 11 kids and no indoor plumbing. So people got creative. Very creative. Let's talk methods, starting with herbal concoctions. Many women turned to herbal remedies passed down through generations. Think of it as medieval grandmother wisdom mixed with trial error and a touch of desperation. Some of the more common ingredients included pennyroyal, known for its abortifacient properties, and also its ability to poison you in high doses. Queen Anne's lace, believed to disrupt implantation. Rude juniper and parsley used in teas and tonics to cleanse the womb. And yes, beaver testicles. One recipe called for boiling them in wine and drinking the result as a fertility-blocking elixir. If nothing else, it was definitely a conversation starter. There were also amulets blessed by priests or sometimes by women who doubled as midwives and unofficial healers. These amulets might contain herbs, bits of parchment with prayers, or strange symbolic items like animal bones. They weren't so much magical birth control as they were spiritual seatbelts low on science, high on hope. But that's not all. Some women wore linen soaked in herbal mixtures as a rudimentary barrier method. Others tried beeswax plugs, yes, that kind of plug or oiled leather pouches inserted before intimacy. While these solutions weren't exactly FDA approved or remotely effective, they reflect a clear understanding that some kind of barrier might help. And then, of course, came the rituals. These ranged from oddly specific to downright bizarre. Jumping up and down after sex, spinning around 3 times counterclockwise while reciting a prayer, burying a cloth soaked with bodily fluids under the doorstep to trap the seed. Yes, that was a real thing. And no, nobody can explain how it was supposed to work. Now let's talk about the elephant in the cathedral, the church. To say the medieval church disapproved of birth control is like saying a dragon disapproves of knights. It wasn't just discouraged. It was labeled sinful, unnatural, and spiritually dangerous. Procreation was considered the only valid reason for intimacy. Anything that interfered with that goal was seen as meddling with divine will. Priests preached against contraception from the pulpit. Confession manuals included pointed questions about whether couples had wasted seed or used impediments to conception. There were even church councils that issued official decrees condemning any form of sexual activity that wasn't open to life. But here's the thing. Just because the church was shouting doesn't mean people were listening, especially among peasants who faced the very real threat of not having enough food to feed another child. Family planning was a matter of survival. Many married couples quietly ignored church teachings, using folk methods to space out pregnancies. They weren't trying to defy God, they were just trying to avoid starvation. And among unmarried couples, the motivation was even more urgent. An unplanned pregnancy could mean social ruin, forced marriage, or worse. For these women, even a small chance of preventing conception was worth the risk of a bizarre recipe or a whispered charm. Of course, none of these methods were especially reliable. So, what happened when they failed? You got hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a whole lot of frantic church paperwork. Some towns had special registries for couples who were clearly expecting before the ceremony. Others issued fines for fornication fees that could sometimes be waived if the couple tied the knot quickly. Think of it as the medieval version of buy one wedding, get one absolution free. But in many villages, especially among the lower classes, practicality trumped morality. If 2 young people were clearly serious and a pregnancy had occurred, families often just made the marriage happen fast. Sometimes with blessings, sometimes with shouting. Now here's something fascinating, a practice called hand fasting. This was a sort of informal engagement or trial marriage where a couple would pledge themselves to each other, sometimes in front of witnesses, sometimes not, and begin living together. In some regions and time periods, hand fasting was legally binding. In others, it was a social loophole that let couples sleep together without technically committing sin, or at least with plausible deniability. The church hated it, of course. Too casual, too unsupervised, too likely to result in babies born a bit too early. Eventually, hand fasting was discouraged, regulated, and absorbed into formal marriage rituals, but not before it gave rise to some of the juiciest church records ever written. Among the nobility, though, things were much more rigid. A noblewoman's virginity wasn't just a personal matter, it was legal currency. Her purity could secure alliances, land rights, and political peace. If a noble bride was found to be less than untouched on her wedding night, the fallout could include lawsuits, annulments, and multi-generational family feuds. To prove virginity, some families relied on witnesses. Others conducted physical inspections. Midwives or matrons checking for the infamous hymen, which science now tells us is an unreliable indicator of anything. But that didn't stop the medieval mind. And if there was any doubt, the classic sheet check. That's right. Some newlyweds were expected to display blood-stained sheets after the wedding night as public proof that everything had gone according to the divine spreadsheet. No blood-cue drama, legal disputes, and more than a few tearful depositions involving phrases like, "But she seemed virtuous." Now, let's flip the double standard. Men, no one cared. A man's virginity was considered optional at best, laughable at worst. He might be encouraged to avoid tavern girls and questionable company, but no one was inspecting his laundry the next morning. The expectation was that he'd gain experience while his bride would enter marriage like a locked chest, literally and figuratively. And let's not forget the religious angle. Virginity, especially for women, was tied to spiritual purity. Maidens were praised in sermons, poetry, and song as untouched vessels or brides of Christ, which sounds poetic until you realize it often meant girls were raised with saint stories involving torture, martyrdom, and an overwhelming fear of flirting. So, yes, contraception in the Middle Ages was real. It was messy, inconsistent, and frequently magical. But it was also necessary, because even in a world ruled by church teachings, practical wisdom passed down from midwife to daughter healer to apprentice found a way to survive. In the next part, we'll tackle another taboo topic, same-sex attraction in the medieval world. What did the church say? How did people live? And what do we make of those suspiciously poetic letters between monks in love, noble women in bed, and the secret history of same-sex attraction in the Middle Ages? Welcome back to our journey through the awkward, layered, and deeply human realities of medieval intimacy. So far, we've covered everything from straw mattresses and forbidden days to DIY contraception involving beaver bits and blessed herbs. But now, let's step into a topic that medieval society rarely put front and center, yet couldn't entirely ignore: same-sex attraction. Let's get one thing out of the way. Yes, same-sex attraction absolutely existed in the Middle Ages, because, spoiler alert, human nature did not magically reboot at the dawn of the Renaissance. What gets complicated is how it was perceived, spoken about, punished, or sometimes totally overlooked, depending on your status, your location, and who exactly was writing the history. Officially, the church had a very clear stance: any non-procreative sex was a sin. That included everything from premarital fumbling to adultery to same-sex intimacy. It was all lumped under the umbrella of sodomy, a term that didn't always mean what modern ears assume. In medieval legal and theological texts, sodomy could include a whole grab bag of offenses depending on the context, the mood of the writer, or the region. But just because the church thundered from the pulpit doesn't mean the rest of society always followed that script. Let's look at the reality behind the rhetoric. We have letters, poems, and even court records that point to real, emotional, romantic, and sometimes sexual relationships between people of the same sex. Monks wrote love letters to each other in Latin letters so intensely affectionate that modern historians still argue, was this spiritual brotherhood or something more? Some of the letters include lines that sound suspiciously less like theological musings and more like love notes. Phrases like, "Your absence wounds me," and "I dream of the warmth of your embrace." If that's just brotherhood, it's a very intense one. And it wasn't just men. Noble women often formed deeply intimate relationships with each other. In many cases, they shared beds, sometimes due to space, other times out of preference. They wrote each other poetry, swore devotion, and exchanged tokens of affection. Were all of these relationships sexual? Maybe not. But were some of them romantic and emotionally committed? Almost certainly. In fact, in noble courts, female companionship was often encouraged as a way to maintain social order, just so long as it didn't interfere with their duties. What those duties were exactly was up for debate. And then There were the all-male monasteries and all-female convents. These were environments that naturally bred close emotional bonds. Brothers and sisters in faith, yes, but also roommates, colleagues, confidants. Some monks and nuns took vows of chastity and lived celibate lives. Others complicated that picture. There are records of scandalous expulsions from monasteries due to inappropriate behavior, but also plenty of cases where no one said a word even if everyone knew. Why the silence? Because medieval society didn't have the same framework for sexual identity that we do today. There were no terms like gay, lesbian, or bisexual in the modern sense. Your identity wasn't based on your romantic preferences. It was based on your family, your trade, your social rank, and your relationship with God. So instead of someone coming out, they might simply live carefully, quietly, sometimes secretly. A knight might share an intense relationship with his squire. A nun might write nightly poems to another sister in her order. But unless someone made it really obvious or threatened public order, authorities often turned a blind eye, especially if the people involved had moneyland or political clout. Of course, when the law did get involved, punishments could be brutal. In some parts of Europe, same-sex intimacy was met with fines, public penance, or forced pilgrimages. In stricter regions, or under more zealous leaders, the consequences could be execution, especially during waves of moral panic or religious reform. But these extreme responses were not the norm for most of the Middle Ages. In many towns, the punishment was more likely to be a sermon and a stiff fine than a burning stake. Interestingly, some medieval stories and saints' lives even hint at same-sex devotion without condemnation. There are tales of knights so devoted to their comrades that they refused marriage, refused titles, and instead chose to be buried side by side. There are nuns whose spiritual friendships lasted decades, filled with letters that read like soul-bearing love letters. Were these just deep friendships? Was the language of the time simply more poetic? Or were they coded relationships hidden in plain sight? Probably a bit of all three. What's important is that these stories existed. They weren't erased from manuscripts. They weren't all denounced. And in some circles, they were even quietly respected as long as no one rocked the boat too hard. And yes, same-sex desire also showed up in literature, though often cloaked in allegory. In some courtly love stories, longing and unattainable affection are central themes, regardless of gender. Troubadour poems written by men sometimes describe desire for other men, especially in the highly stylized form of knightly admiration. Likewise, a few female poets of the time wrote about their beloved sisters with language that today would make TikTok speculate for hours. But what about the average medieval person? The baker's apprentice, the blacksmith's daughter? For them, same-sex attraction had no guidebook, no community, no protective movement. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just meant it was often lived in the margins through glances, through gestures, through secret late-night conversations, and through the very human experience of loving someone you weren't supposed to. Did people gossip about it? Of course. Did they sometimes punish it? Yes. But did they also understand quietly that love doesn't always follow rules? Absolutely. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most radical act in medieval life wasn't defying the church. It was loving someone in silence and never getting caught. In the next part, we'll explore a different kind of forbidden love, adultery, because nothing says drama like a noble woman, a forbidden affair, and a local friar who suddenly knows way too much. Adultery scandal and the medieval walk of shame. Welcome back to our deep dive into the raw, ridiculous, and sometimes painfully relatable world of medieval intimacy. We've tiptoed around straw beds, skipped through birth control recipes involving root vegetables and whispered spells, and now it's time to step into a topic that practically wrote the gossip columns of the Middle Ages: adultery. Let's be clear right from the start, adultery in medieval Europe wasn't just about broken hearts. It was about property power and bloodlines. Marriage wasn't just a romantic agreement, it was a legally binding contract, a spiritual covenant, and more often than not, a strategy. So, When someone broke that contract, things got messy. First, we need to understand what adultery meant in this era. The double standard was thick enough to build a castle on. A married woman caught in an affair could face serious consequences: public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, social exile, or even imprisonment, especially if she was noble. If she got caught with evidence, a child born out of wedlock, for example, forget shame. We're talking full-blown family crisis lawsuits, annulments, and potential banishment to a nunnery. In extreme cases, noble families quietly handled the problem in more permanent ways, usually involving a swift and discreet exit from public life. Think less romantic tragedy, more medieval true crime. But for men, let's just say the rules were looser. A married man who had an affair with an unmarried woman might be called immoral, yes. But unless the woman's family was powerful or particularly angry, there was usually no legal punishment. If he was caught with another man's wife, the situation got more serious, but it still rarely matched the fallout a woman would face in the same situation. Why the imbalance? Because medieval society was obsessed with lineage. A man had to be sure his heirs were his. A woman's fidelity wasn't just about emotions, it was about inheritance. If a nobleman suspected that his child wasn't truly his, that could mean land and titles ending up in the wrong hands. Adultery threatened the entire system. That's why noble women were monitored so closely. Chaperones locked chambers, scheduled appearances. Everything was about protecting their virtue and preserving their family's reputation. And if that failed, the fallout could ripple across kingdoms. But here's the thing, despite all the risk, adultery still happened. A lot. In fact, it was such a frequent occurrence that entire legal systems sprang up just to handle it. Some towns had moral courts that investigated claims of infidelity. Evidence could include witness testimony. I saw them walking behind the granary at dusk, suspicious pregnancies, or even letters. If a case went public, the punishment varied. Fines, forced penance, public confession, and in some places, especially in France and parts of Germany, a literal walk of shame, barefoot through the streets, wearing only a shift with a crowd watching. In more lenient regions, couples were simply pressured into reconciling. Maybe the affair was swept under the rug. Maybe the guilty party made a donation to the local church and everyone agreed to pretend it didn't happen. Especially if they were rich. Especially if they were men. Let's pause on the monastic reaction. Because you better believe the church had something to say about adultery. Adulterers were often assigned spiritual penalties like prolonged fasting, public prayers, or repeated confession. Priests and bishops wrote entire manuals on how to handle adulterous relationships, and their questions got personal. Did you commit the act with full intent? Did you enjoy it? Was it your idea? Let's just say medieval confessionals were not built for emotional subtlety. But for all this, church-sponsored shame enforcement could be wildly uneven. Some priests were deeply invested in rooting out sin. Others couldn't be bothered. And then there were those who had their own affairs, which really puts a new twist on judge, not lest ye be judged. And now we arrive at the wildest part of medieval adultery law, the honor-killing loophole. Yes, it was a thing, especially among the nobility. If a husband caught his wife in the act, some legal systems allowed him to take appropriate action, a phrase that often meant bloodshed. If he killed his wife and her lover in the heat of passion courts, might show leniency or waive punishment altogether. Medieval justice now with 75% more sword fights. Nobles who engaged in adultery risked scandal, yes, but they also had more resources to cover it up. Secret trysts in hunting lodges, long letters delivered by loyal servants, payments made to silence witnesses. Some affairs lasted for decades and were open secrets tolerated as long as they didn't mess with politics or inheritance. Meanwhile, among peasants, the stakes were different, but still real. Infidelity in a small village could mean being shunned at the market, losing your social standing, or facing public humiliation. But since most peasants didn't have land titles or noble bloodlines to protect, the fallout was more personal than political. Often a fine would be paid, apologies made, and life would go on, albeit with a few more side eyes during Sunday Mass. But what drove people to risk it? Just like today, the reasons were complex: loneliness, unhappy marriages, power dynamics, genuine attraction, or sometimes just boredom. Many medieval marriages, especially among the nobility, were arranged without regard for personal compatibility. Love was a bonus, not a baseline. And when emotional needs weren't met at home, people looked elsewhere. Sometimes those affairs were passionate. Other times they were manipulative or coerced, especially when there was a power imbalance. Lords taking advantage of servants. Priests exploiting confessional intimacy. These dynamics were often hidden, but not rare. And then there's the art and literature. Adultery was a favorite topic of medieval poets, troubadours, and playwrights. Courtly love stories often revolved around knights pining for married ladies with coded messages, secret handkerchiefs, and dramatic declarations. These tales weren't just fantasy. They were reflections of the tension between duty and desire that existed in real life. One famous tale, the love triangle between Lancelot, Guinevere, and King Arthur. It captured everything medieval society feared and romanticized loyalty, tested by love betrayal cloaked in nobility, and the downfall of an idealized kingdom brought on by passion. So, what does all this tell us? That for all their rules, rituals, and religious fervor, medieval people were still people. They struggled with temptation. They broke the rules. They whispered secrets in the dark, wrote love poems they shouldn't have, and sometimes paid a heavy price for the heart's rebellion. In the next part, we'll take a look at consent in the medieval world, how it was defined, distorted, and debated, and what happened when someone dared to say no. Consent in the Middle Ages, between I will and you will. Welcome back. After diving headfirst into the chaos of medieval adultery with its fine scandals and courtroom drama, it's time we confront a topic that's even more emotionally loaded, ethically tangled, and historically misunderstood: consent. Now, when we talk about consent today, we think in terms of mutual agreement, clear communication, and personal autonomy. But in the medieval world, consent was defined through a very different lens, one made of law codes, dowries, family pressure, church doctrine, and a whole lot of what will the neighbors think? Let's start with marriage, because in medieval society, marriage was the legal, spiritual, and social core of everything. And surprisingly, at least on paper, the medieval church insisted that consent was necessary for a valid marriage. You heard that right. According to canon law, if two people exchanged verbal consent, meaning they both said, I will, with intention and understanding, they were married even without witnesses, a priest or a fancy feast involving questionable venison. This was known as verba de praesenti, the present tense marriage vow, and it counted. That's how we got things like clandestine marriages, where couples would secretly promise themselves to each other and consider it binding. The church technically recognized these unions, but they were a legal and pastoral nightmare. If one partner later denied it ever happened, or if a family tried to block it, things could spiral fast. And yet, for all this talk of mutual consent, reality often played out differently. Among nobility, marriages were usually arranged. Families treated marriage like a land deal with emotional collateral damage. A young woman might be consulted about her future husband, but her actual consent came after the contracts were signed and the wine had been poured. Refusing a match could mean being disowned, sent to a convent, or married off anyway, just with more drama. And among peasants, things were a little more flexible, but not free of pressure. Saying no to the miller's son might mean offending your father, your neighbors, or risking your family's standing. Autonomy existed, but it had limits and consequences. So, what about consent within marriage? Here's where things get particularly uncomfortable. Once married, a woman was expected to render what theologians called the marital debt. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? This meant both spouses owed each other sexual access, because marriage was supposed to be open to procreation at all times. If one partner withheld sex without a valid reason like illness, pilgrimage, or fasting season, the other could appeal to the church to intervene or even seek annulment. That means the concept of marital rape as we understand it today did not legally exist. A husband forcing himself on his wife wasn't a crime, it was tragically a right. The church did try to soften this by encouraging kindness and mutual respect. But let's not kid ourselves, women had very little protection if things turned abusive behind closed doors. This wasn't just social, it was spiritual. Marriage was seen as a cure for lust, and the wife was the vessel for that cure. Husbands were told not to be cruel, yes, but they were also told they had needs, and the wife was their divinely appointed outlet. However, and this is important, not all women were silent victims. Medieval court records, especially from cities like London, Paris, and Bologna, show that women did sometimes file complaints against their husbands for physical abuse, abandonment, or coercion. In some cases, they won. Local courts might issue fines, grant separations, or force public penance. But these wins were rare and often depended on the woman's social class, her family's support, or the severity of the offense. The system leaned heavily against her. Still, the fact that some women fought back and succeeded proves that even within this lopsided framework, resistance existed. Now let's look beyond marriage at unwanted advances, coercion, and assault. The legal systems in medieval Europe did acknowledge rape as a crime, but their definitions were narrow and enforcement was erratic. For many jurisdictions, rape was defined not by the victim's lack of consent, but by the violation of a man's property, either her father, husband, or her future husband. That's right. It was often treated more like theft than violence. Punishments for rape ranged from fines and exile to, in extreme cases, execution, but only if the victim had high status or the assault was particularly brutal. Lower-class women rarely saw justice unless their communities rallied around them. And proof, that was the hardest part. Victims had to show visible injuries, scream for help, or report the assault immediately. If she waited, or worse, if she became pregnant, many courts assumed consent. Yes, pregnancy was considered evidence that she must have enjoyed it. Medieval biology was not exactly leading the scientific frontier. Even more disturbing, in some areas, a rapist could avoid punishment by marrying his victim, a practice rooted in the idea that marriage restored her honor and ensured she'd still have a place in society. Never mind how she felt about it. Her shame was now legally managed. And yet, even in this bleak landscape, there were cracks of awareness. Some theological writers acknowledged that consent mattered not just in contracts, but in intimacy. Some court cases show women successfully accusing powerful men of coercion or violence. And in literature, too, the theme of resisting unwanted advances appears sometimes as cautionary tales, other times as triumphs. Take the story of Lucretia, for example, a Roman noblewoman raped by a prince and later used in medieval sermons to talk about chastity and virtue. Her suicide was seen as the ultimate statement of honor. Today, we might view it as a tragic comment on a world where women had no other recourse, but even then, her story carried power. It made people talk, and that's part of the strange complexity of the Middle Ages. While the systems were stacked against women, while law and church often failed them, the stories they left behind in poems, complaints, confessions, and legends still whisper the truth. Consent mattered, even if the world didn't always admit it. In the next part, we'll tackle another huge contradiction: how the church promoted celibacy and spiritual purity, even while most of its followers were trying to make babies in overcrowded homes. Prepare for theological, hair-splitting, saintly awkwardness and more rules than any honeymoon should have to survive. Celibacy saints and the church's uncomfortable obsession with marital moderation. Welcome back to our slow, steamy, and sometimes itchy journey through medieval intimacy. We've covered everything from scandalous affairs to how the concept of consent was bent broken or barely understood. But now, it's time to step into the sanctified and surprisingly judgmental world of the medieval church's teachings on sex. Here's the question: did the church ban sex? Not exactly. The church knew that marriage was necessary not just to make more Christians, but to prevent people from falling into worse sins like fornication, adultery, or the dreaded sodomy bucket that got thrown around a little too liberally. So, yes, married couples were technically allowed to have sex, but here's the catch: they were encouraged to approach it with the enthusiasm of two people filling out tax forms. In other words, do it, but don't enjoy it too much. Let's break it down. At the top of the spiritual hierarchy were the celibates, monks, nuns, and priests, at least post-12th century, when clerical celibacy became mandatory. Celibacy was considered the gold standard of holiness. If you could live your life without giving in to carnal temptation, you were seen as spiritually superior. Saints were often praised for turning down pleasure, not for managing it responsibly. And this attitude filtered down into the marital bed. Theologians like St. Jerome, St. Augustine, and later Thomas Aquinas had a lot to say about what happened between married couples. Spoiler, they were not fans of passion. Let's take Augustine, for example. He's one of the most influential Christian thinkers in history, and also one of the most conflicted. Before converting, Augustine lived what might be generously called a romantically busy life. But after finding faith, he swung hard in the other direction, declaring that lust was a result of original sin and that sex, even in marriage, should be controlled, restrained, and definitely not fun. St. Jerome was even more intense. He claimed that a man who loves his wife too ardently is an adulterer. That's right. If you liked your spouse too much, it was basically cheating on God. These weren't just personal opinions, they became the basis of Christian sexual ethics for centuries. So what did the church actually allow? Sex for procreation, thumbs up, but like half a thumbs up. Sex for pleasure, sinful, unless you accidentally enjoyed it while making a baby. Sex during Lent, Advent, feast days, fast days, Sundays, or when you just felt too spiritually inspired. Hard. No. Anything but missionary position. Suspicious at best. Heretical at worst. Kissing, caressing, or dirty talk. Dangerous gateways to sin. And this wasn't just moral posturing, it showed up in confession manuals. Priests were instructed to ask married couples whether they had committed excessive lust even with their lawful spouses. That included whether they had enjoyed themselves too much, acted with too much passion, or used positions that were not natural. There are records of priests asking questions like, did you lie on your side? Did you speak impure words? Did you delay completion for pleasure? No wonder some people went to confession once a year, or never. But the church didn't just discourage pleasure, it encouraged abstinence within marriage. Yes, married celibacy was a thing. Some holy couples, especially in their later years, would take vows of chastity and live like siblings, praying instead of anything else. These arrangements were praised as spiritually advanced. If a couple abstained from intimacy completely, they were seen as halfway to sainthood. You can almost hear the monks cheering in the distance. But what if one spouse wasn't on board? That's where the idea of the marital debt returned. If your spouse wanted sex for legitimate baby-making reasons and you refused, that was a sin. Even holy abstinence had to be mutual. The church wanted you to balance holiness with obedience, a theological tightrope act that could exhaust even the most pious. And yet, for all this sexual micromanagement, people still lived their lives. Most peasants didn't consult a feast day calendar before climbing into bed. They had other concerns like weatherwork, hunger, and staying warm during long winters in one-room homes with drafty walls. They probably gave a polite nod to the priest's warnings on Sunday, then went home and did whatever they had the energy for. Even among the nobility, church teachings were often more aspirational than operational. A knight might receive spiritual guidance before heading to war, but once he was home with his lady and 3 goblets of wine in him, he wasn't exactly meditating on St. Jerome's letters. So why did the church work so hard to control sex? Because control of the body was control of the soul. In a world where salvation was the highest goal, anything that distracted people from God, especially something as powerful and primal as sexual desire, was treated as a threat. The church wasn't just regulating behavior, it was trying to shape thought identity and even pleasure itself. But here's the strange twist. Some spiritual writers did talk about intimacy in positive terms as long as it pointed toward divine love. Mystical texts written by nuns like Hildegard of Bingen and Mechthild of Magdeburg describe union with God in language so passionate it borders on erotic. Jesus was sometimes described as a lover, the soul as a bride. Even the Song of Songs, a sensual poem from the Bible, was interpreted as an allegory of divine intimacy. It's almost like the church knew that human longing when aimed at heaven was powerful. It just didn't trust people to aim it correctly on their own. And so we got rules, and more rules, and then footnotes to those rules, all with the goal of taking something deeply human and trying to make it safe for salvation. In the next part, we'll ask a very modern question. In a medieval setting, did people actually fall in love? Spoiler, yes. Awkwardly, intensely, and sometimes beautifully. Because even in a world of dowries and arranged marriages, the human heart was always a little rebellious. Did they fall in love romance in a world of contracts, cows, and curfews? Welcome back to our medieval slow burn romance series where love lives between plagues, parchments, and people pretending they're not cold. In the last part, we looked at how the church tried to sanitize sex, confine desire, and turn the marital bed into a holy obligation. But now it's time to ask the question we've all been dancing around. Did people in the Middle Ages actually fall in love? The answer is yes, awkwardly, secretly, passionately, and sometimes with more risk than reward. Even in a society where marriage was usually arranged, love still managed to sneak in through the side door, often with muddy boots and a flower picked from the market ditch. Let's begin with reality. Marriage wasn't about love, not at first. For most people, it was about economics and survival. Among peasants, marriages helped consolidate land tools and labor. If your neighbor's daughter came with a cow and you had 3 extra sacks of barley, congratulations, you were halfway to a proposal. Among nobles, it was even more transactional. Marriages, sealed alliances merged, territories ended feuds, or ensured that your second cousin wouldn't invade your village next spring. Daughters were essentially diplomatic currency. Sons were investment vessels for family legacy. Love, that was a bonus, not a requirement. But that didn't mean people were heartless. In fact, the desire for love ran parallel to the structure of arranged marriage. People longed, hoped, flirted, and occasionally defied expectations, and when they couldn't, they turned to the one outlet that let them dream art. Let's talk about courtly love. This was the emotional outlet for the nobility. A poetic, chivalric, often over-the-top celebration of unattainable romance. Think knights writing poems to married ladies longing from afar and declaring that their lady's glance had wounded them deeper than a sword ever could. In courtly love stories, the object of desire was almost always married. The point wasn't consummation, it was devotion. The love was meant to elevate, not to be fulfilled. It was dramatic. It was performative. It was a medieval soap opera in verse. And it served a real function. It gave noblemen and women a safe way to express emotions that might otherwise be forbidden. It provided a script for longing, suffering, and admiration without requiring anyone to actually get naked and risk their titles. Poets like Chrétien de Troyes and Andreas Capellanus wrote entire manuals on how to love properly. Spoiler, the rules were absurd. Don't love too eagerly. Never be jealous. Don't confess love too soon. And definitely don't ask for anything physical. Basically, suffer beautifully. But outside of parchment and prose, real people fell in love too. We have court records, letters, and folk songs that prove it. Some peasants eloped. Some refused arranged matches. Others waited years for a partner they actually liked. And when they married for love, it was a big deal, not just romantically, but legally. Remember, the church required verbal consent from both parties to validate a marriage. That meant 2 people had to say, "I will," of their own free will. If a father tried to force a daughter to marry someone she hated, she could sometimes appeal to a priest or bishop and win. Not always, but sometimes. Love didn't just live in the shadows, it sometimes won the day. We also have examples of spouses who clearly adored each other. Letters exchanged during times of war or separation show deep affection, humor, concern. Noble women writing to their husbands expressed worry for their safety, joy at their return, and yes, complaints about household drama. Even peasants, whose voices were rarely recorded, left behind hints of affection. One 14th century Englishman wrote in his will that his wife should receive all the good apples from the harvest because she had always been the sweetest of women. That may not sound like Shakespeare, but in a world where food was love, that's basically a proposal on paper. And then there are the widows and widowers. Many remarried not for alliances or heirs, but for companionship. These second marriages were often freer, less burdened by family politics. A woman who had fulfilled her duty as a wife might finally get to choose someone she liked. A man who had suffered through an arranged match might marry a friend, a neighbor, or a longtime admirer. In those moments, love wasn't a rebellion. It was a reward. But of course, there were risks. Falling in love with the wrong person could destroy reputations. It could lead to secret affairs, pregnancies, exile, or in extreme cases, execution. Love stories in the Middle Ages didn't always end in happily ever after. Sometimes they ended in scandal sermons or a sudden trip to the monastery. Still, people tried. They sang to each other in the fields. They exchanged tokens, a braid of hair, a handkerchief, a carved piece of wood. They met at wells, at market stalls during the harvest festivals. They wrote riddle songs and secret notes. Even if they couldn't read or write, they found someone who could. The human heart, it turns out, has always been creative. And love didn't just live between lovers. It lived between friends, siblings, parents, and children. The medieval world was tough. Life was short. Plague, famine, war, and childbirth were daily threats. So when love bloomed, whether romantic, familial, or spiritual, it was cherished. It wasn't always poetic. Sometimes it was loud. Sometimes it smelled like garlic and damp wool. But it was real. So the next time you picture a medieval wedding, don't just imagine the dowries and contracts. Picture the bride sneaking a smile at her groom. Picture the peasant couple dancing barefoot after harvest. Picture the knight returning from battle and falling to his knees, not in prayer, but in relief at seeing his wife again. Love existed, even when no one expected it to. In the next part, we'll unravel the infamous legend of chastity belts. Did they really exist? Were they used? Or were they just a Renaissance joke that we took way too seriously? Chastity belts. The irony of iron underwear. Welcome back. By now you've probably realized that medieval intimacy wasn't all thou art, my one true love under the moonlight. It was more, are the kids asleep, and did the pig leave the house? But tonight, we tackle one of the most bizarre, overblown, and widely misunderstood inventions ever associated with medieval sexuality, the infamous chastity belt. Let's set the scene. You've likely seen it in cartoons, Renaissance festivals, or memes, an iron contraption complete with padlocks and ventilation holes supposedly strapped to a woman's waist to keep her virtuous while her husband went off to war. The narrative goes something like this. Sir Geoffrey is off crusading. Lady Eleanor has been locked into an armored undergarment until he returns in 7 years. There's only one key. He keeps it in his shoe. For honor. Sounds intense. Sounds medieval. Sounds like something the church might have handed out with your wedding candle right. Except, not really. The truth is, the chastity belt, as popularly imagined, was never widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, the vast majority of so-called medieval chastity belts displayed in museums today, they're Victorian reproductions or satirical Renaissance pieces meant to mock medieval prudishness, not actual historical devices. Let's look at the facts. There is no credible archaeological evidence of chastity belts being used in the 11th, 12th, or 13th centuries. The earliest known references to something resembling a chastity belt don't appear until the 15th century, and even then they're usually in the form of jokes, warnings, or literary satire. Some of the surviving belts discovered in European collections have since been debunked. Metallurgical tests show they were made centuries after the Middle Ages, some as late as the 19th century, when Victorian collectors were obsessed with the idea of medieval repression and morality. Ironically, the chastity belt may tell us more about how later societies imagined the Middle Ages than about the era itself. But okay, what if, just hypothetically, someone did try to use one? Let's talk logistics. We're talking about an iron belt strapped around soft, unwashed, wool-covered flesh. The design would have caused chafing, infections, utter misery, possibly gangrene. And that's assuming it fit, which most didn't. There's no evidence of tailor-made belts, no surviving ledgers from blacksmiths listing custom genital armor, no church guidelines for their proper use. In fact, medieval texts are oddly silent on the whole thing. And let's be honest, this is a time period where people wrote about everything, including how many times a week was appropriate for married couples to try and make babies. You'd think something as dramatic as locking up your wife's reproductive system would have come up, but it didn't. So, why do we think chastity belts were real? Because later societies, especially in the Renaissance and Victorian eras, were obsessed with sexual morality, and even more obsessed with how immoral they imagined the medieval period had been. The chastity belt became a symbol, not a tool. It was used in satirical woodcuts, morality plays, curiosity cabinets, which were essentially proto-museums filled with weird artifacts, sex-negative literature that wanted to paint the past as either brutishly repressive or wildly lustful. In other words, the chastity belt was fake news for the morally anxious. So how was fidelity maintained in the Middle Ages? The answer is social structure, surveillance, shame, and strategy. Noble women were heavily chaperoned. If you were married into a high-ranking family, you weren't left alone with anyone who hadn't been cleared by the entire extended family and possibly your priest. Peasant women were watched just as closely, but by their community. Villages functioned like unpaid private detective agencies. Everyone knew everyone's business. The church constantly reinforced the idea that an unfaithful woman was a danger to her soul, her family, and the entire social order. Reputation mattered. A single rumor could ruin a woman's marriage prospects, reduce her dowry value, or trigger a socially enforced form of exile. In short, they didn't need belts. They had gossip. But if we want to get technical, some medieval societies did attempt to control women's sexuality through clothing and ritual. Noble women, for example, were often dressed in elaborate heavy garments that weren't exactly conducive to quick dalliances. Public ceremonies emphasized chastity, piety, and obedience, and if you strayed, there were real consequences, legal, social, and sometimes violent. The chastity belt just added an extra layer of metallic melodrama to a world already overloaded with moral regulation. Still, there were whispers of belts used for specific reasons much later in certain 16th or 17th century contexts, not for chastity, but for protection against rape, especially during long, vulnerable travel or imprisonment. But even those references are rare and debated. More likely, they were symbolic deterrents, not practical tools. Today, the image of the chastity belt survives because it's so ridiculous. It represents the worst mashup of misogyny and medieval misrepresentation. But it also serves as a cautionary tale. When we oversimplify the past, we often end up believing myths that say more about us than them. Because here's the truth. Medieval women didn't need iron belts to keep them faithful. They had pressure from the church, surveillance from their communities, economic dependence, and real fear of being cast out. The idea that someone needed to physically lock up a woman's body assumes that her mind, her choices, and her world didn't already do that job. The chastity belt is just the rusty punchline. In the next part, we'll dive into something even more surprising: brothels as legal businesses in medieval towns. That's right. Some cities didn't just tolerate sex work. They licensed it, regulated it, and even taxed it. Prepare for red light districts, medieval HR departments, and the world's most awkward job descriptions. Medieval red light districts, brothels, bureaucracy, and the business of pleasure. Welcome back to our unapologetically real journey through medieval intimacy. We've just dismantled the myth of the chastity belt metallic nonsense mostly invented by nervous Victorians. And now we turn to something far more grounded in fact sex work in the Middle Ages. Because here's the medieval plot twist no one saw coming. In many towns across Europe, brothels were not only tolerated, they were legal, regulated, and taxed. That's right. In a world where priests preached celibacy, where saints fainted at the sight of ankles, and where couples were told not to enjoy marital sex, too much cities were issuing permits for public houses of pleasure. Let's break this down. Why legalize sex work? Simple. Because it was going to happen anyway. Medieval city leaders weren't stupid. They knew that large populations of single men, especially soldiers, sailors, and apprentices, weren't going to spend every evening in prayer and quiet contemplation. So, rather than letting the trade operate in the shadows, some towns chose to bring it into the light. Regulated brothels became a way to contain disease, limit street-level harassment, protect respectable women, collect revenue, control a population of restless men. It was pragmatism over purity. So, how did it work? In many cases, brothels were established just outside town walls or in specific districts often marked by red lanterns, symbolic carvings, or a local nickname. These areas were sometimes called things like Grope Cunt Lane in English cities. Yes, that was an actual street name. Or Rue des Femmes Publiques in parts of France. Women who worked in these establishments were referred to as public women, bordello girls, or simply whores. But don't let the language fool you. These were legal titles in many towns, and in some places, the women even paid guild fees, had set prices, and were protected by specific town ordinances. Cities like Florence, Paris, London, Vienna, and Barcelona had entire bureaucracies built around the management of sex work. Some towns required women to be examined for diseases. Others specified that they wear certain clothes, often yellow or striped, to distinguish them from honest women. Some cities made them wear veils. Others required that they work only during certain hours. In Avignon, which was technically papal territory, the brothels were so well organized that they kept books, actual ledgers, with earnings, names, and expenses. One 14th century brothel even kept track of which girls earned the most per client. If that's not medieval capitalism, I don't know what is. And yes, the church knew. Despite its teachings, the church often looked the other way. Why? Because the alternative rampant sexual violence, unsanctioned affairs, and social unrest was considered worse. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the church's most influential theologians, once wrote that prostitution was a necessary evil like a sewer in a palace. Unpleasant, but better than the alternative. Charming metaphor, really. Who were the sex workers? The women who ended up in brothels were usually poor, orphaned, widowed, or outcast. Many had no dowry, no family support, and few other options. Some were sold into the trade by desperate relatives. Others joined voluntarily to escape abusive households or to avoid starvation. But make no mistake, for many, this was survival, not liberation. They were often bound by debt to brothel owners expected to entertain multiple clients a day and were vulnerable to abuse from customers, pimps, and even city officials. Healthcare was minimal, legal protections were inconsistent, and once labeled a public woman, it was almost impossible to return to respectable society. Some tried to escape by entering convents if the convent would take them. Others tried to marry their way out. A few managed to start their own businesses, becoming madams who ran the brothels themselves. These women were often savvy, politically connected, and knew how to keep both the clients and the magistrates happy. In rare cases, these madams were even taxed as official business owners. Think of it like a medieval version of a small business license, except instead of selling ale or shoes, they were offering, well, more personal services. Who were the clients? Everyone. Married men, priests, pilgrims, soldiers, merchants, students, even kings. That's right. Royalty weren't above visiting the brothel, and some were known to keep long-standing relationships with specific women. The lines between prostitute mistress and companion often blurred, especially for powerful men who had the means to offer gifts, apartments, or entire estates. In fact, some royal mistresses gained real political power. Look at Agnes Sorel, mistress to King Charles VII of France. She wasn't technically a sex worker, but her rise from courtly flirt to national influencer shows how female sexuality could be both weaponized and rewarded in the right circumstances. And what about same-sex brothels? While rarely documented, there are hints that male sex work also existed, usually targeted toward traveling nobles, clergy, or wealthy men. These establishments were less formal, less publicized, and often operated under the radar. But medieval legal texts occasionally reference men arrested for indecent acts for payment, which strongly suggests a parallel trade. So, was this just tolerated or encouraged? Both and neither? Brothels were often caught in a moral gray zone. Towns wanted the taxes, but not the scandal. Churches preached against sin, but quietly accepted that licensed lust was better than chaotic vice. Women were both used and blamed, and the laws shifted constantly depending on who was in charge, how much money was flowing, and whether a moral panic was in the air. Eventually, the tide turned. By the late 16th century, as Reformation ideologies spread and public health fears grew, especially around syphilis, many brothels were shut down. Cities that once issued licenses started cracking down. Sex workers were driven underground again. And the centuries-long dance between regulation and repression continued. But for a few hundred years in the medieval heart of Europe, sex work was a public institution managed with ledgers, ordinances, uniforms, and fines. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't safe, but it was real and more integrated into society than we've been led to believe. In the next part, we'll move away from the city streets and into the sacred halls of religion, because while monks were writing about sin, some were also breaking their vows behind closed doors. Get ready for scandal secrecy and the eternal struggle between flesh and faith. Holy vows and unholy desires. Sex scandals in the monastery. Welcome back to our candlelit tour through the contradictions of medieval intimacy. We've just visited the legal red light districts of the Middle Ages, complete with receipts and regulations, and now we pivot to a place where sex was supposed to be absolutely off limits, the monastery. Because what happens when you take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and then break every single one of them? Let's talk about monks, nuns, priests, and the deeply human truth that desire doesn't disappear just because you're wearing a robe and quoting scripture. First, why the celibacy rule? Celibacy wasn't always a requirement in early Christianity. In fact, married priests were common in the early centuries of the church. But over time, especially by the 12th century, Rome pushed for full clerical celibacy. Why? To ensure priests' undivided loyalty to God, to prevent dynasties, priests handing down church property to their kids, and, let's be honest, to consolidate church control over wealth and inheritance. But enforcing celibacy wasn't easy, especially not in a world where most monks joined religious life in their teens before fully understanding what a lifetime of abstinence actually meant. So what happened? They improvised behind cloistered walls. What the records reveal? Let's start with monasteries. Life inside a monastery was structured, repetitive, and designed to keep monks busy. Prayer, study, work, sleep, repeat. But when human nature pressed up against that schedule, particularly at night, things got messy. Some monks formed emotional and physical relationships with each other. Others had trysts with local women who brought supplies or sought spiritual advice. Some even sneaked out at night or arranged rendezvous through back doors, gardens, or confessionals. There are actual records of monks being caught in bed together, of monasteries being scolded for wanton behavior, and of monastic brothels operating on the sly. That's right. There were cases where monasteries were accused of harboring sex workers, sometimes with the full knowledge of their abbots. Talk about a loophole in the vow of chastity. In one infamous case from 14th century England, a bishop launched an investigation into a monastery where several monks had fathered children, kept mistresses, and even used church funds to pay hush money. When confronted, some claimed the devil had tempted them. Others said the rules were too harsh for men of flesh and blood. Meanwhile, out in the world, parish priests weren't exactly saints either. While they were technically bound by the same celibacy rules, many kept concubines, unofficial wives who cooked, cleaned, and shared their beds. These arrangements were often tolerated by local communities, as long as the priest was doing his job, not flaunting the relationship and not fathering too many kids. And speaking of kids, yes, some priests had them. Lots of them. There are even church records with lists of fines for clergy who had illegitimate children. Instead of excommunication, they'd pay a penalty and keep preaching. It was less sin and you're out, and more sin, pay up, and be discreet next time. What about the women nunneries like monasteries were places of spiritual retreat and human drama? While many nuns lived sincere, devoted lives of contemplation and service, others didn't fit the mold so easily. Some had joined against their will, forced into convents by families who didn't want to pay dowries. Others joined young and grew restless, and some simply fell in love. Historical records show that some nuns secretly corresponded with lovers, were caught pregnant sometimes multiple times, escaped their convents, and never returned. In one case, a nun faked her own death to escape and marry a man she'd fallen in love with during confession. When the bishop found out, he demanded she return. She refused. They excommunicated her. She still refused. Her final letter, "I'd rather be with a living man than a dead God." Medieval mic drop. There are also reports of same-sex relationships among nuns, though these were almost always veiled in euphemisms. Spiritual friendship, sisterly affection. But when letters between certain nuns start sounding like full-blown love poetry, it's hard not to read between the lines. The church's response: shame, silence, and strategy. The church wasn't oblivious to these scandals, but it was strategic. When caught, monks and priests were sometimes relocated rather than punished. A priest with a mistress might be sent to a more remote village. A pregnant nun might be quietly transferred or even placed under house arrest in a correctional convent. Why? Because the church feared scandal more than sin. The institution depended on public trust, and nothing shattered that faster than stories of Father Gregory's 4 children or Sister Agnes and her secret lover. So rather than addressing the root causes, loneliness, unrealistic expectations, power, dynamics, the church often swept things under the altar rug and kept the incense burning. But not all monks were hypocrites. It's important to say this: many monks, priests and nuns, truly lived their vows. They fasted, they served the poor, they lived with nothing, they resisted temptation. Some even went to their graves believing that desire was the ultimate test of faith, a fire they had to walk through daily to become closer to God. They weren't perfect, but they were sincere. Others, though, they turned their robes into camouflage, using power, influence, and spiritual authority to manipulate, coerce, or indulge. And that's the paradox of medieval religion. It aimed for heaven, but never escaped earth. In the next part, we're going back to the people, peasants, villagers, and workers, and exploring how they actually navigated intimacy. No cathedrals, no castles. Just simple homes, community gossip, and the very practical side of medieval relationships. Love in the mud peasant intimacy and the real medieval romance. Welcome back. So far we've traveled through brothels, monasteries, courtly love, and the tangled ethics of chastity. But now, it's time to zoom in not on kings, bishops, or poets, but on the everyday people who made up the majority of the medieval population. Let's talk about peasants. Because while nobles were signing marriage contracts with wax seals and monks were reciting vows of celibacy, most folks were just trying to survive the week, raise a few pigs, avoid plague, and maybe, just maybe, fall in love, get married, or at least get a little cuddle before the fire went out. First things first. What did peasant marriage actually look like? It wasn't a white dress, organ music kind of affair. It was practical, local, and community-driven. Most peasants married people from the same village or neighboring one. You rarely traveled more than a few miles from home, so your romantic options were limited to whoever shared your dirt road, helped with harvest, or flirted at the spring well. Dowries existed, but they were modest, maybe a few chickens, a patch of land, or a good cloak. Parents often arranged matches, but not always. In many regions, especially by the later Middle Ages, young people had surprising autonomy in choosing their partners. This was partly due to church doctrine. Remember, mutual consent was necessary for a valid marriage. If two people said, "I will," in front of witnesses, that was technically enough. That said, community pressure mattered. If the village didn't approve, if your lover was from a bad family, already tangled in another engagement, or just smelled funny, you might find your love story sabotaged before it even began. What about premarital sex? It happened a lot. In fact, testing the relationship before marriage was surprisingly common, especially among peasants. The idea was that if a couple had already committed to each other emotionally and a wedding was imminent, then getting intimate wasn't necessarily scandalous. Some communities even had hand-fasting, a sort of informal engagement where a couple pledged themselves to each other for a year and a day. During that time, they could live together, sleep together, and essentially act married. If a child resulted, they were expected to marry for good. And if they didn't, well, that's where church courts came in. There are countless records of medieval couples dragged before ecclesiastical judges to explain who said what when and in front of whom. These cases read like dramatic soap operas. She promised to marry me under the apple tree. He said he loved me before the feast of St. Martin, but never came back. We lay together, but he swore he would take me as wife. Often, the court sided with women, especially if pregnancy was involved. The man might be ordered to marry her or pay compensation. If he refused, he could be shamed, publicly fined, or even barred from church services. This wasn't about morality alone. It was about stability. A community couldn't afford too many single mothers, fatherless children, or bitter feuds. The church wanted peace, and marriage was peace legally, spiritually, economically. Where did people get together? The medieval version of Tinder included seasonal festivals, think May Day, not Mardi Gras. Working together in the fields, fetching water at the same well, local taverns or ale houses. Church gatherings, yes, sermons, and flirting. There were even folk traditions designed to encourage courtship, like springtime dances, games, or rituals involving garlands, singing, and light-hearted teasing. In some parts of Europe, young people participated in bundling a sleepover ritual, where a courting couple could share a bed fully clothed and under strict rules, but still close. You can imagine how often that rule was broken. How did intimacy work in tiny houses? Most peasant homes were one-room cottages shared by the whole family. If there was a bed, it was usually in the corner, shared by multiple people. Children slept nearby, sometimes on benches or straw mats. Privacy was minimal. So what did couples do? They got creative. Some waited until everyone else was asleep. Others slipped into barns, woods, or fields. And in winter, well, it's amazing how much intimacy can be packed into a shared blanket under a thatched roof. The lack of privacy didn't eliminate romance, it just made it quieter. A whispered joke, a hand squeeze during chores, a stolen kiss while tending sheep. Did love last? Sometimes, sometimes not. Medieval peasant marriages could be deeply affectionate, especially when both partners worked side by side, shared hardships, and raised children together. There are stories of husbands and wives who wept at each other's funerals, who left sentimental notes and wills, or who spoke with tenderness even in front of grumbling neighbors. But there were also abusive marriages, loveless unions, and people trapped by necessity. Women in particular had limited options. Divorce was rare, separation was hard to win, and economic dependence made walking away almost impossible. Still, the human desire for love, comfort, and belonging never went away. Folk songs, peasant poetry, and oral stories passed down through generations show that even the poorest villagers longed for connection. They sang about heartbreak. They joked about mother-in-laws. They dreamed of better matches, warmer homes, and sweeter kisses. What about queer love? We don't have much written evidence about LGBTQ+ relationships among peasants, largely because these relationships were invisible by necessity. But scholars believe that just like in any era, same-sex desire existed, was sometimes acted upon, and sometimes quietly tolerated. Church courts occasionally punished men or women for unnatural acts, but these cases were rare and ambiguous. Most of the time, such relationships existed under the radar, hidden beneath friendships, shared labor, or companionships that no one dared question too closely. Love medieval style. In a world where life was harsh, short, and uncertain, intimacy was a survival tool. It warmed the soul. It made chores bearable. It built alliances, ensured help during childbirth, and gave people a reason to keep going. Even without ballads or armor, peasant love mattered. It wasn't grand, but it was real. It was smudged with dirt, wrapped in wool, and spoken in dialects we no longer understand, but it pulsed with the same longing that still fuels us today. In the next part, we'll step into the shadowy world of punishment and shame, because when love or lust broke the rules, medieval society didn't just frown. It branded, banished, or burned. Lust and the lash when desire was a crime. Welcome back. We've seen love bloom in peasant cottages, flirtations echo in stone cloisters, and brothels humming with life under the gaze of city officials. But now we dive into the darker side of medieval intimacy. What happened when things went too far? Because while sex was everywhere, so were the consequences. Medieval Europe wasn't just a world of whispered romance and hidden trysts. It was also a world where love and desire, when expressed outside the boundaries approved by church and community, could become a crime. And the punishments, often as public as the sins, were private. First, let's talk about the crime board. What kind of behavior could land you in front of a judge, or worse, a mob? Let's make a list. Adultery, fornication, sex before marriage, incest, even distant cousins counted. Sodomy, a catch-all term for anything not considered natural. Prostitution outside licensed areas. Homosexuality, public lewdness. Sex during holy days. Sex in churches. Yes, it happened. These weren't just frowned upon. They were often criminalized, especially when they threatened the social fabric, created scandal, or embarrassed powerful people. But not all sins were treated equally. Adultery, sin of the rich and the reckless. If a married woman was caught cheating, it could destroy her. In some towns, she could be whipped publicly, paraded through the streets in shame, banished, or even stoned, depending on the time and place. Men, on the other hand, faced lighter consequences unless they were sleeping with another man's wife or a noblewoman, in which case honor duels or political fallout could get violent fast. Sometimes husbands were allowed to punish their wives privately or even kill their wives and their lovers under honor laws, especially in places like Italy or southern France. Adultery wasn't just personal. It was a threat to lineage inheritance and male pride. Fornication. You did what without a ring. Unmarried couples having sex could be dragged before church courts and fined. A woman who became pregnant out of wedlock was almost always held responsible. The man, if identified, might be ordered to marry her or pay child support. But often, the woman bore the brunt. She could be ostracized by her village, denied church sacraments, or forced to wear humiliating clothes like the cloak of shame, literally a robe dyed bright red to show her guilt. And the child marked as illegitimate with limited rights to inheritance or property. Sodomy and homosexuality. The silent fear. The word sodomy in medieval Europe wasn't just about same-sex relationships. It referred to any non-procreative sexual act, including oral sex, anal sex, or anything that strayed from the approved script. But make no mistake, homosexual relationships, especially between men, were singled out for the harshest penalties. In many regions, men accused of sodomy were fined, imprisoned, branded, or even burned at the stake. The punishment often depended on class. A noble might escape with a warning, a peasant might hang, and many of these punishments weren't just about morality, they were about control. Same-sex love challenged the church's narrative about sexuality, marriage, and gender roles. As for lesbianism, it was far less mentioned, partly because women's sexuality was so often dismissed or misunderstood. But when it was prosecuted, the penalties were severe. In some rare but documented cases, women accused of same-sex relations were shaved, imprisoned, or sentenced to death by burning. Their supposed tools, like carved phallic devices, were sometimes burned with them. Public shame punishment by spectacle medieval punishments weren't always about jail. They were about humiliation. Imagine this. A man caught cheating is tied to a cart paraded through town while villagers hurl mud and rotten eggs. A woman caught with a lover is forced to wear a donkey tail and a bell around her neck as she walks through the market. A pair of adulterers are made to crawl through the cathedral on their knees while the town watches. These weren't symbolic. They were meant to scare everyone else into staying in line. Shame was a weapon, and one wielded mercilessly. When love crossed lines, incest, and forbidden unions, medieval canon law prohibited marriage or even sex between people up to the 7th degree of kinship. That's your fourth cousin for those keeping track. Why? Because inheritance, family alliances, and bloodlines were sacred territory. A marriage between two people too closely related could be annulled even after children were born. In some places, even spiritual kinship counted. If someone had sponsored your baptism, for example, you couldn't marry into their family. Violating these rules, another ticket to court. And if you happen to accidentally marry your cousin without permission, you might find your marriage nullified, your land seized, and your name disgraced. Did anyone ever escape these rules? Of course. Power protected. Nobles, clergy, and the wealthy often got away with everything from open affairs to illegitimate children, especially if they donated enough to the church, covered things up, or bribed the right official. For everyone else, though, the rules were rigid. But here's the twist. Despite all this shame and punishment, medieval society was also deeply obsessed with sex. They couldn't stop talking about it, singing about it, writing about it, and punishing people for it. It was, in a weird way, entertainment. Gossip was a village sport. Confessionals buzzed with scandal. And while sin was condemned, it was also used as spectacle, as a way to draw lines, reinforce control, and remind everyone who was in charge. The church didn't just fear lust. It depended on it to fund penance, to enforce obedience, and to build a worldview where everyone needed saving. In the next part, we're going to explore what happened when the world started to change, when medicine, morality, and early science collided with centuries of doctrine and superstition. Because even as society punished sin, it also began to study it. Get ready for witches, midwives, and the terrifying rise of the idea that some people's desire wasn't just sinful, it was demonic.